What's up guys, I'm Rich from Spray Black Studios, and today I'm going to show you how to level up your basing game using Weathering Pigments. So there's no end of products available for you to base your miniatures with. Whether you go for the good old tried and tested techniques such as sand and paint, or whether you go for the newer products like the Games Workshop texture paints, the Vallejo earth textures, or the AK Interactive Terrain series. The only problem here for me, however, is that most of these products are just a single colour, and a short walk through a local park or building site will show you that actually soil and rubble is rarely ever just a single colour. You'll get all manner of different tones, whether it be earthy tones with a bit of vegetation in it, or just a general different colour of bricks, of concrete, or whatever may be growing in amongst. Now you don't want that basing to detract from the miniature itself. Throwing a lot of different colours in can cause a bit of confusion and can take the attention away from that awesome paint job that you've already done. But it is always my aim to try and bring a little bit more of a sense of realism to my miniatures, so for this I will try and replicate some of those tones. Now there are many videos out there on using things such as actual soil or coconut husk to get a little bit more of a realistic feel for your basing, but many of these will involve quite a lot of extra work, for example putting the soil into an oven to properly dry it out just to make sure that it's not going to rot on you. Now if you've seen my videos before, you'll know that although I do spend quite a lot of time on my paint jobs, I am a little bit lazy and I do like a good shortcut, and why cause myself a lot of extra work when I can use something that's already on my paint rack. So today I'm going to show you how to use the Vallejo Weathering Pigments to give a nice bit of realism to these bases and to achieve the effect we want with actual very little fuss. So first we need to build ourselves a base. I'm going to use a nice GW 40mm base to give plenty of space to work on, but I don't want it to be completely flat, so let's build up a little bit of a landscape on top of it. Starting off with some broken up bits of cork sheet, I'm going to add a little bit of height. The cork sheet is super easy to break apart using just your fingers, and by doing it this way and not by cutting it, you can get nice rough edges, just like a rocky outcrop would actually have. I'll use some super glue to attach these on, being very careful to not stick myself to the base and being mindful that the cork is actually quite porous and does let some of that super glue through. I'll also add in a couple of these larger lumps of cork just to add some larger loose rocks and debris too. For texture on the base, I could easily use something like the Citadel texture paints, but for today I want to add something a little bit more coarse, so I'm going to use some modelling sand. Now a lot of people use PVA glue for this, but I always find that super glue is much stronger and will survive much better than the PVA glue, which can often break away from the base or peel off over time. Having used a cocktail stick to spread the super glue around the base, I'll then dunk it in the sand. Now I want to add a little bit more visual interest to this base rather than just leaving it as the broken up rocks and sand. So to give it a proper feel of a ruined city war zone, I'm going to add a little bit of broken barbed wire. To give some metal work to attach the barbed wire to, I'm going to take this 2mm styrene rod and cut it down slightly. I only want a short length of this and it's pretty soft, so a simple craft knife will do the job pretty easily. There's no need for grabbing out a modelling saw or a Dremel tool at this point. Again, using super glue, I'll fit it in place against one of those rocky outcrops, and then grabbing out my pin vise, I'm going to create a small hole in the top of it just to feed the barbed wire through to keep it in place. For the barbed wire itself, I'm going to use the Army Painter Battlefield Razor Wire. This is super easy to use and actually pretty cheap. Whilst it does state that it is razor wire, don't worry, it's not sharp and it isn't going to cut you while you're working on it. Using a pair of wire cutters, I'll chop off the length that I want, and then to really make it look like some proper Warzone razor wire, I'll grab out this brush protector, which is roughly the right diameter for what I want, and wind it round. Remove it from the brush protector, it will generally stick in place and go a little bit springy. To fix it in place, I'll return to that super glue, and then because it is rather springy, I'll need to make sure that I get this to fix in place nice and quickly. For this, I'm going to use the Army Painter Super Glue Activator. This stuff just takes a couple of quick sprays and it will cause the super glue to set almost immediately. This chemical reaction does leave a little bit of residue, and because it's set straight away you don't really get any of it evaporating away, so some of those gaps in between the sand will be filled, but once we get the pigments on, this won't really be much of an issue. Now I'd say this base is ready for some paint. To prime this base, I'm going to use the Vallejo Surface Primer. This is my favourite primer to use at the moment, as it can be done through the airbrush, which is really handy when living in the UK and prone to plenty of rain and cold weather. Now the black is probably a little bit too dark for what I want at the moment, so I'm going to go to my trusty Liquitex white ink and apply some very thin layers on top of the rocky outcrops. This will just bring up to more of a mid-grey colour. To give some highlights to those rocks and to the rubble, I'll do a spot of dry brushing. With the Dawnstone dry paint, I can be fairly aggressive with this dry brushing. Since the sand was super glued down, it shouldn't be going anywhere. This dry brushing will catch all of those raised areas and the edges of those rocks to give us a little bit of depth, but we do want to push those highlights just a little bit higher, as the later steps will flatten this down a little bit. So I'm going to turn to a bit of Celestra Grey to do a real super light dry brush just to finish it off. For the razor wire, I'm going to go fairly simple and use a couple of techniques from my more recent Grimdark Using Only Games Workshop products video. And starting with a nice base coat of Leadbelcher, I'm not going to worry too much about any highlighting or any real shading, and instead I'm going to get the visual interest using some weathering techniques. Using some heavily thinned down riser rust in an almost wash-like consistency, this will settle in all those recessed areas and give us that nice look of a bit of rusty metal. With a little bit of Nailac Oxide added in certain areas of the razor wire just to give another colour added into the mix, we're pretty much done with the painting. Now for a tabletop standard army, I'd be pretty happy with this. It's a decent monotone rubble base that certainly would not look out of place in a ruined city. But at the start of the video, I did promise that I would show you how to level up bases like this. So here we go. The method that I am going to use to get some more realism into this base is, as I've mentioned, by using Vallejo Weathering Pigments. If you've watched my previous videos, then you will have definitely seen me using these pigments before. Normally to provide some weathering effects on things like my Raven Guard armour, and on many models to add some dirt and dust to tie them into their bases quite nicely. Grabbing out a nice dry synthetic brush, I'll dab these pigments onto the areas that I want them. Starting with the burnt umber, I'll spread the pigments around and work them into the recesses between those grains of sand that I applied earlier. Using the same brush, I can remove some excess with some super light brushing motions, just to get some of that grey to shine back through again. With some brown iron oxide, I'm going to add in a few more reddish tones into those browns. With this one, I'll pick my spots a lot more, and will be much more sparing, as I don't want to turn this into a Mars base. Now it's very brown and dirty right now, and I do want to keep this as a ruined city base. So using some dark slate grey, I can work this across the base just to tie it in nicely to all that underpainting that we did. I will spread this a lot more than I did with the browns and with the brown iron oxide, and I will try and get this more dusty across the top of the rocks. As a final touch, I do want to push that contrast just a little bit higher, so with some carbon black pigment I'll pick out a few areas just to darken it down and give the impression of a few burnt areas, maybe where some explosives have gone off. Now as these pigments do have relatively good adhesion, they will hold okay if you're doing a display miniature and it's just going to sit in a cabinet. But if you want to use these in game, then I highly suggest you fix them in place. Adding some white spirit will fix these pigments in place, although will cause them to lose a little bit of that dusty look. A final layer of varnish will seal these in, and we're all done. So there we go, a lovely nice simple Ruined City base, and one that I think is going to fit in fairly well with most miniatures painted in the Grimdark style. While there are many other techniques and methods for getting a little bit more realism into your basing, these Weathering Pigments for me are a very easy and pretty cost effective way of doing so. A pot of these Vallejo Weathering Pigments will cost you about £3, and they come in a huge range of different colours, whether it be the browns and the rust colours, or whether you go to things like the metallics or to the monotones like the dark slate grey and the carbon black. There is generally something there for near enough any effect you want. There's even a pretty bright green one for adding in oxidation to metals. These pots also last for absolutely ages. I'm still using the same pot of carbon black that I bought when I first started using these pigments, and I can say that it is still far from being empty. If you've enjoyed this video, then please hit that like button down below to help appease the almighty YouTube algorithm, and please feel free to let me know any other techniques or any other methods that you use on your basing, just to push that level up a little bit more than just your standard paint and dry brush. I'm always willing to try new techniques and always happy to hear from you guys. If you haven't already hit that big red subscribe button, then please consider subscribing to the channel. I've got plenty of more ideas coming for some Grimdark tutorials that I don't think you're going to want to miss. And remember guys, if all else fails, spray it black and start again.